Hi, friends. I want to give you a quick heads up that in this episode, we talk about our guest's involvement as a counselor for a youth mental health crisis hotline and how she works with teenagers who are experiencing thoughts of self harm and suicide. If this is a topic that's too uncomfortable, please consider forwarding through that portion of the episode or skipping this episode altogether. If you or someone you know is having a mental health crisis, please call or text 988 immediately. If you're uncomfortable talking on the phone, you can chat on the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline found at 988lifeline.org. That's 988lifeline.org. Additionally, the Trevor Project is a resource for youth who are experiencing a mental health crisis and want to talk to someone. The Trevor Project was established for LGBTQ youth. To reach a counselor at the Trevor Project, you can text 678 678. You can call 1 866 488 7386, and you can go to their website at thetrevorproject.org. That's thetrevorproject.org. And those resources are listed in the show notes as well. Thank you.
And I noticed a lot of negative, well, that's not going to work, or I'm not going to be able to do X, or that person isn't going to buy into my concept, etc. And so catching it and, in a coaching situation saying, tell me more about this story I'm hearing you tell yourself. Like, what's that about? And why is that true? Is that true? What would you do if that were not true? Questions like those help just sort of lift the veil, right? So you've got deeper awareness of the story that you're telling yourself. And then I can say, hey, what do you think about crafting a new narrative to replace that one? Would you like to work on that?
Hi, I'm Roger Kastner, and welcome to the What Do You Know to Be True podcast. In these conversations, I talk with ordinary people about their extraordinary skill, their superhero power, and the meaningful impact it has on others. The goal is not to try to emulate it or hack our way to a new talent. Instead, I'm interested in what inspired our guests to develop this talent, how they think about their superhero power, and the impact it has on others. The intention is to learn about their experience with their superhero power, and in doing so, maybe we can learn something about the special talent in each of us that makes us unique. You've probably heard someone say, the story I'm telling myself is, and this technique is helpful because it lets us and our listeners know that we hold the possibility that other storylines may exist, and that the one we're telling ourselves and others right now is malleable and might change. While we believe it to be true in the moment, we recognize that the story is subject to change based on new evidence and perspectives. This conversation today is with Corinna Calhoun, and one of her superhero powers is helping others to rewrite their inner narrative. In this episode, Corinna shares how to understand, unpack, and change that story we're telling. We cover how she became inspired to rewrite her inner narrative, and from that experience, she shares a 4-step process she learned that she now uses to help others rewrite their inner narrative. And of course, she tells us what she's learned to be true and not true about rewriting the stories we tell ourselves. What can stand between us and the thing we want for ourselves, or how we show up for others, are what Corinna refers to as limiting thoughts and the deep groove of a storyline that we keep repeating to ourselves. And yet, we can make a different choice. Corinna shows us how we have a needle across the record moment when we rewrite or re-etch the grooves our storylines travel in, to sing a new song, to have a new narrative that supports who we want to be and how we want to show up. If you're ready, let's dive in. Hello, Corinna. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Good to see you today.
Good to see you too. So today we're talking about your superhero talent of rewriting inner narratives, and would love to start off with who inspired you or what inspired you to develop this talent.
About, I would say, 7 or 8 years ago, I really started hitting a wall career-wise. I was working in tech. I'd been working in tech for a very long time. And I came to realize that the reason why I was struggling with job satisfaction was because I had created this inner narrative that was all about my value being directly tied to the scope, scale, and complexity of the job that I had. And what happens when you have a very narrow definition of success is it's very easy to miss it. And after a bunch of self work, lots of deep questioning of how that story got started and why I had held on to it for so long, I decided to rewrite it. And rewriting my own concept of self-worth has led to all kinds of adventures and new learning and deeper connections with other people, honestly, as well.
So that we're on the same page about rewriting the inner narrative, how would you define that?
Think about what tapes play in your head on a regular basis, right? We all have certain stories that, and in some cases, they serve us when we first create them, right? I'm a fantastic problem solver. I'm the kind of person who blank, right? Unfortunately, sometimes these stories become or are inherently negative or limiting in some way. I never do well on math tests. I am not the kind of person who, right? And so part of the trick for me was even, becoming aware that I had this story, this tape that was playing that said, unless you are doing X, you are not worthy, right? And so coming into awareness about this narrative took some time for me to sit still with myself and say, what am I telling myself? What is the tape that's playing in my head? And then what do I want to do about that?
Tell me a little bit about how this this shows up for you in your work and in your friendships and with your family.
Sure. Well, before I do that, I'll break down a little bit of the process that I identified for myself, because I had to understand and fine tune my own mechanism for this before I could explain it to anybody else, right? It's like being really good at math. If I can't tell you how I solve the math problem, it doesn't really help you very much at all. So, and I will say, I give credit to Peter Senge, Chris Argyris. There's been a lot of work done on inner narratives, how to rewrite them, what that process looks like. But I kind of cribbed down my own. And I've done this for multiple narratives, not just the one that I had about work and worth. So the process is this. First, I write down whatever the story is in as much detail. And it's great if you can catastrophize this. Like, oh, I'm completely worthless if I'm not, blah, 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 but in as much detail as possible, sort of remembering internal conversations I've had with myself, right? And then the second process is data collection. So I write down all the reasons that story is not true. So where's all the evidence that I can find that, statement A, statement B, statement C is inaccurate. And then the fun part starts, which is then I write down what's the new narrative. So for me, in my own personal case, I wrote a story around my worth as a coach, employee, mother, wife, etc., friend is tied to being of service to other people, right? Which is a much more expansive narrative. There was a lot of different ways to be of service to other people. And then the fourth stage is I started, and I go back to this on the regular, collecting data that proves that the news story is true, right? Here's the evidence. Oh, I feel more connected. I'm, in closer contact with relatives I hadn't spoken to in a while. I feel more impact in my coaching work and so on. So once I was able to sort of break it down like that into pretty manageable chunks, I started using this in my coaching work with my clients in particular. So I've got a couple of clients who are female entrepreneurs, and I don't want to make any, sort of broad statements, but it can be a tough kind of work environment to be in. And I noticed a lot of negative, well, that's not going to work, or I'm not going to be able to do X, or that person isn't going to buy into my concept, etc. And so catching it, and in a coaching situation saying, tell me more about this story I'm hearing you tell yourself. Like, what's that about? And why is that true? Is that true? What would you do if that were not true? Questions like those help just sort of lift the veil, right? So you've got deeper awareness of the story that you're telling yourself. And then I can say, hey, what do you think about crafting a new narrative to replace that one? Would you like to work on that? Is that something that's interesting to you? It's not for everybody, I will say that, meaning, there's an edge of woo-woo to some of this that can come up, especially with very rational minded people. Well, what if I do have evidence that the other story is true? Like, what if I am right? Which is a whole other fascinating conversation about resistance and why we resist things. But for those people who are genuinely curious about the impact of language, especially internal language, on our lived experiences, and curious enough to want to take action, I've seen some pretty powerful results come about as a result of folks working very intently on shifting their internal talk track.
Okay, there's a couple things I would like to pull the thread on. One,
Sure.
this idea of people that have evidence that proves that their story is true. What do you do? What do you do for them?
How's that story working for you? It's as simple as that, right? It's I was talking to a client the other day about, there's that saying in psychology about relationships that you can be right or you can be in a relationship. Well, you can be right or you can be in a loving relationship with yourself and telling yourself, affirming narratives that are more likely to engender positive behavior, right? So it's not about like completely making up farcical notions of who we are, right? I'm not going to sit down and be like, I'm going to write a narrative about how I'm a neurosurgeon and I can go do brain surgery because, yeah, why not? But if there's a story that I've created that is limiting my ability to be present, to be empathetic, to be curious, to enter into things with sort of an open heart, it behooves me to work on that narrative, right? It's only going to make me a better person if I believe that I can change. And it's true scientifically, right? Neuroplasticity. We're constantly creating neural pathways in our minds. And it's really about which ones you choose to create. It's like I tell people, I always think of like a greyhound on a track, right? The more that greyhound runs around the track, the deeper the grooves get. So you can do that with a story about not being good enough, right? Or a story about I'm never the person who, fill in the blank. Or you can, direct your greyhound to a different track, right? And it's difficult at first because it's accustomed to running in the track that it's been in, but you will fire up new neural pathways that become the new default narrative with training and patience over time. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, it's usually around, do you want it to be effective or do you not?
And I imagine there's an element of confirmation bias here, that people are looking for the data that supports the stories that they are telling themselves. And so there could be a little bit of that vicious cycle where they have some evidence, they tell themselves a story, they go find more evidence, where on one hand, showing them evidence that might be a little different, or
Mm-hmm.
having them look for the opposite
Yes.
data. And then I love the way you put it. Like, okay, how is that story working for you? If you want to change it, you need to
Mm-hmm.
do differently, do better to be better type thing. Is
For
it?
sure. Yeah. I mean, I love that you bring up the confirmation bias because it's so wired into our human behavior. We are not aware of it, but what we look for is what we find. And if our brain is looking for evidence that we're a crap friend, or we can't um, contribute in the way that we've always wanted to, or whatever it is, then our brains, without any further direction whatsoever, it's just going to go look for that data in the background, right? So that step of writing the new narrative and then choosing to go look for confirming data that the new one is accurate is just, it's just a neurological hack. You're just hacking your brain to go pay attention to something different than what it has become accustomed to paying attention to.
You were explaining the really a data driven approach
Mm-hmm.
and the data that we pay attention to. Um, and it's the emotional side that I think
Mm-hmm.
probably drives a lot of the storytelling, but the unpacking and reforming, rewriting is feels like it's more on the data driven side, on the
Mm-hmm.
logic side. Where does emotions come into play on both the
Mm-hmm.
beginning and the rewriting side?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the data driven approach, it works, right? And it does bridge, it creates that bridge for somebody who is highly logical, highly rational, to maybe engage in some self work that they wouldn't do if it didn't seem structured and based in neuroscience, which it is. um, Emotions are very important on a couple of different fronts. I don't know where I even want to start with this because I could go on. You'd be like, all right, we're wrapping up here, Calhoun. I mean, the first thing I would say about emotions is you need enough negative emotion to trigger the change in the narrative in the first place, right? If you don't
Mm.
have enough negative emotion, you're not going to be motivated to change. Things are good enough. You're going to kind of keep telling yourself whatever the story is, and keep humming along and keep getting more of what you're getting, right? And so one thing I would say is, like, it helps to do this work with other people, right? That's why it's easy for me to catch these narratives with my clients, because I'm listening to their words at a level that they may not be, right? And I can spot these things and then say things like, how does it feel when you tell yourself that story, right? What emotions come up for you? What sensations are coming up in your body right now as you tell me that, right? And if it matters, then the person will get in touch with that negative emotion. It feels awful. I feel tightness in my chest. I feel like that burning behind my eyes, like I'm going to cry. They'll get into contact with the negative emotion, which is what propels change and growth, right? We don't get it for free. So I guess, one is having a friend or a partner or a coach or somebody in your life who is listening to you well enough to help you access whatever the story is that's limiting you in the first place, right? So that's one place for emotion. The other is on this journey, right? I talked about the 4 steps. Um, Part of the looking for affirming or confirming data about the new narrative is paying attention to how you feel. How do I feel when I tell myself this story? And when I feel that way, how do I behave? Right? And you get into that behavioral change pattern, and that is when you really start cooking with gas, right? Oh, I'm calling my friends more frequently. I'm inviting my family over for dinner. I'm going on date nights with my husband, whatever it is, right? Okay, what's happening then, right? So you want to get it sounds absurd, but you want to get into the muck, right, of the negative emotions as impetus towards doing the work, which then brings you to the positive emotions, which reaffirm whatever the behavioral changes you've taken.
When I've heard people talk about storytelling, there is a combination of the emotional side and the logical side, and that they need to be married together, or the story's probably not going to land as well. And so I think the way you just broke that apart really helped crystallize for me how both, the data is really important for us to understand the story that we're telling ourselves and rewriting that story, but also the emotional part, like what are the feelings and what are the behaviors, both probably in the original story as well as the story we want to rewrite.
Yeah, there's a great worksheet that I was turned on to by a professor of mine, and I'll look up who created it. I always forget, but it's called One Belief at a Time, and it's got more questions. It's differently structured than the process I typically use, but one of the things that's really magical about it is it asks questions like, who would you be without this belief? And so in thinking about tapping into emotions, like that question by itself can elicit a lot of strong emotions. I mean, it appeals to the intellect as well, because you're like, gosh, I haven't thought about that. That's a really interesting question. But then who would I be without this belief can really unlock a lot of like really important emotions like regret, shame, guilt, these kinds of emotions, which are difficult, but again, serve a purpose as indicators that it's time to change, right? And the first step is now potentially for somebody.
And as you were saying that, I was thinking about the importance of identity. Like, who do we say we are? Not only the story, but who we are, the character that we play in the, in the novel, in the movie of our life. And the story that we're telling ourselves right now is just a chapter. But once you tie it into identity, which is so tied into emotions and feelings and behaviors, and likely, the part that we're telling ourselves about our identity is, I would assume, is not the full picture.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of theories around that. If you look at family systems theory or parts work, I don't know if you're familiar with that, right? Like our concept of identity is typically formed early in life by different parts that are trying to protect us, right? And then we grow up, and a lot of times we have internalized whatever that narrative is about who we are, what our core identity is. And we don't ever bring it out into the light and really examine it. And then, there are other pressures, obviously, if somebody's working through gender identity or sexual identity or racial identity or any kind of identity work as they go through life, that can become very complicated, right? I thought I was this person. Now I feel like this person. It can be very untethering to not have a clear and coherent sense of identity that matches how you want to show up in the world. Identity gets very complicated for me. I'm not as clear in my own head about like all the forces at play there, other than to say, again, like it really helps to have other people help through this kind of work, right? Because identity is also socially constructed, right? So it's going to be socially, your sense of yourself is going to be influenced by the people that you're talking about your identity with, right? If we surround ourselves with people who are supportive and open-minded and whatnot, we can have a more expansive idea of our identity. Or with people who are judging us or have beliefs about different identities being more valuable than others, it constricts our sense of who we are, right? We become those labels. And so not only is it important to have people to talk through these things, these topics with, but who you choose is really important as well.
So tell me about the work you do with the Trevor Project and
Yeah,
how rewriting inner monologues, narratives, stories
sure.
come into play there.
Yeah, for any of your listeners who are not familiar, the Trevor Project is an organization that serves LGBTQ youth in crisis. So we've got a bunch of different programs, including a 24/7 crisis line for young people. We also get people outside of that demographic, and we get people who don't identify as LGBTQ, but that is the population that we seek to serve, to help them in moments where they might be thinking about ending their life, or are in crisis of some other kind. And so I am a volunteer crisis counselor. So what that means is I take calls from young people in crisis, do about 12 hours a month, across 4 different shifts. And what I've noticed, and I can tell, sort of a vignette that puts this into a story that I think folks can understand. But what I notice, especially with people in crisis, is the most negative talk tracks are the ones that come to the surface, right? That's where you get both stories about how hopeless a situation might be. This is never going to change. It's never going to get better. Nothing that I can do, anything in that range. And also, unfortunately, especially for these young people in some of them in very rural areas, really difficult areas where there's a lot of anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ legislation, and bias and bigotry and so forth. They've also, a lot of them, internalized narratives about that there's something wrong with them, right? And then you add to that potential body dysphoria, right? I am one person, but when I look in the mirror, this sort of meat thing in front of me doesn't match that, right? So there are a lot of different layers that these folks are navigating. And so, the work that I do as a crisis counselor is very specific. I'm trained based on the protocols that they train us on. But the vignette that I'll share, one example of maybe creating some awareness for these folks in crisis is around, asking them to explore their story a little bit more with me. So the vignette in question, I was talking to a young person really struggling, just it's about a 2-hour call, and a lot of escalation of emotion, right? So a lot of tears, a lot of hyperventilating, a lot of this sort of the helplessness, but also, what was heartbreaking was they kept using slurs on themselves, like words I will not even use in this conversation because they are offensive. But they were referring to themselves over and over again. I made this, I made that. And, I said at one point, I said, I keep hearing you say these words. And I wonder, are those your words or are those somebody else's? And the caller was silent for a good couple of seconds there, which was the first time in the call that they had been quiet like that. And they didn't really, it was one of those moments where I'm not certain that I made the impact that I hope that I did, but that pause, that if you can get an exhale, that's even a better signal that like something important is happening, right? That pause made me hopeful that the next time that person uses that language against themselves, they might ask themselves that question: are those my words or are they somebody else's? And in that question, it's like the Viktor Frankl quote about the space between stimulus and response, right? In that space is a choice. And maybe with asking the question over and over again, maybe the choice becomes, those are not my words, right? That is not how I choose to describe myself. So that's how this kind of work plays out in the crisis counselor context specifically.
So first off, I want to say thank you. I can only imagine the long line of parents who want to give you a hug for having a conversation with their children that they may never know about, but the idea that you were there in their child's most precious moments, that where they were at risk, and it's it sounds cliche to call it life changing, a life changing experience, but that doesn't sound that far off from what you're giving these people. As you described that, that experience of asking that question and getting them to have that pause, to take that Excel, it sounds like you have got them from their reptilian brain working on the emotions, working on that story, to asking them a data question that brings them up to the prefrontal cortex, and they have to think outside of that deep groove that they're in of the story that they're telling themselves.
Yep. The greyhound is looking around. Wait a second here. maybe there's a rabbit over in that field over there. Yeah, absolutely. It's another hack. If you want to, I don't use that in a negative frame at all, right? It's, if I know that I can train my puppy to go outside instead of on the floor, I'm going to do that. If I know that I can train my brain to go behave in a way that's going to produce more positive results, then I'm going to do that, right? I don't know why I have so many dog references here, but they just seem to be present for me today.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. I'm okay with dog references. But the word hack is an interesting one, because I think of what you're giving people as a gift, and getting them to get out of that rut, to think about, they're probably not even aware that they're telling themselves a story, and they're not even aware of the impacts that story has, and they're not even aware of where that story is not true, which becomes super valuable, where they start questioning the validity of the story they've been telling themselves, what they think of their own identity, what they think about themselves, and showing them that it's possible to think differently just for a moment, and maybe that moment's long enough.
Yeah. Well, and I think the more you practice, the easier it gets, right? Because what we're talking about is just metacognition. What do I think about how I'm thinking, right? And it can feel clumsy at first, especially with these sort of inner narratives, inner monologues that we're so familiar with, right? It's like background noise. I've been playing these tapes forever and ever. And so popping out of that, a gift hack, it's both, right? It's learning how to step out of that and examine the thought process and say, I get to choose if I want to continue having this one, or if I want to have a different one and replace it with something else. Yeah.
And maybe this answers the earlier question around, why is it so valuable to have this in conversation with someone else? Because that groove might be so deep you can't get out of it. But having someone else question, why are you in that groove? Why are you telling yourself that story?
Depending sense making is depth social
of that group. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We can't.
Say more.
I mean, so we can do some sense making on our own, right? So I know you're a fan of the morning pages as an example, right? And that's that's a mechanism for us to get our thoughts on paper where we can observe them and make choices about them. But most sense making is deeply social, right? And so we co-create, and we talk our realities into existence. And so the other thing that I was thinking about is just that we haven't talked about as much. We've been talking more about internal work or kind of one-on-one work, but organizationally, right? You, the OD guy, you know this better than anybody, right? What are those organizational stories that need to be rewritten? Why are you always in the number two spot behind company X, right? Why, whatever the organizational story is, a lot of times people aren't even that. It's like the water, you forget that you're even telling these stories. But if you can get a group to identify them and acknowledge them, then the group can decide what kind of different story they want to create for themselves and what new data they want to go find to support that new narrative. So yeah, it's the more brains you can get positively focused on this activity, the more expansive you're going to get a canvas of a potential new set of narratives that a group or an organization can choose to take.
So, what do you know to be true about rewriting inner narratives?
I know it's easier with other people. I know it takes patience. I mean, I've been working on that one story for what, 7 years? It still comes up and I'm like, you again? What are you? I thought I got rid of you. And it's like, ha ha ha,
Hello,
back.
old friend.
Yeah. Are you feeling angry or lonely or tired? I'm going to creep back into your consciousness. So, yeah, so it works best with other people. It requires patience and it works. Those are the three things I know to be true.
What did you believe early on about rewriting inner narratives and have learned that it's not true?
I grew up with a very fixed idea of capabilities and strengths, and have always been, I would say, typically more in the intellectual versus the emotional, sort of brain. And so for me, it really, I did not grow up or have early adulthood experiences that were conducive to rewriting inner narratives. I just thought whatever that tape is, it's logical, it's correct, and I'm just gonna make it work, right? I'm just gonna work within it as much as I can. And so it really wasn't, again, until I got really deeply unhappy and deeply dissatisfied in a work context that I was forced to go explore other alternatives.
So, you had mentioned that this change in how you thought about your own um, inner narrative happened
Mm-hmm.
about 7 years ago. And you, I believe, in that time have become certified as a coach. I
Yep.
believe, and well, I know that you just recently graduated with your master's in organizational development. Um,
Yes.
this this period of 7 years seems to be one of tremendous growth for you.
Mm-hmm.
And how much have you been rewriting your story along that time, or has it been the same story that you
Mm.
rewrote 7 years ago?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I would say it started 7 years ago, but it's been this, that, it's been all over the place. I would say, in hindsight, it kicked off. I was actually working at Amazon at the time in like the biggest, most complex, very intellectually satisfying job I've ever had, and yet I was miserable.
Mm.
And so I can still remember the day that my what would we call this? My existential crisis started.
You get to write the story. I guess
I
you get to
see.
write the title
I
too.
guess, yeah. We don't need to go there, but like there was a full Jerry Maguire like moment in my
Hmm.
head, at least. Not, I didn't grab the goldfish and storm
Mm.
out, but yeah. It so to answer your question, it started about 7 years ago, but it's been up and down and left and right. The the like true narrative work, I would say I started in early 2020. So I didn't even get to that stage for, 3 or 4 years of other efforts to understand. Well, first there were efforts to run away from how I was feeling. Those were not successful. And then there were efforts to understand it, which eventually led to me hiring a new coach and getting into this narrative work and identity work. Since then, I have I have revisited, I actually have it in a notebook. It has like stickies all over it. I've revisited the original, the OG 4-step narrative about my self-worth, but I've also done mini narratives. And so I've sort of looked around the edges of that self concept that I started working on in 2020, and I've explored like where else can I improve this, right? As a parent, there's lots of material. If you ever need to like really go to town on limiting beliefs, oh my gosh, yeah. So I've kind of revisited the core, and then I've looked at how can I, what's still holding me back, and what do I want to work on next. I highly recommend anybody going through a period in their life where they're like, something's just not clicking right and I want to figure out what to do about it. Go hire a coach, hire a good one, do your shopping, meet with the ones until you find the one. But again, it's that person who is listening intently to understand, as opposed to give advice or to fix or to advise, that can really help bring these things into the light.
Is this work easier to do with a friend or with someone who is not personally invested in your experience?
I think it's best done with somebody who has the skills to listen without judgment, right? And sometimes the people who are closest to us are actually the worst people to do this kind of work with, because they've got their own stories about who you are, right? And those are, depending on what the level of relationship is. I mean, go talk to my kid, right? He's got a very clear idea of what kind of person I am.
They might help pile on the negative data.
God, yeah. Well, and those people who are closest to us often want to protect us, right? There's a genuine desire to make things easy for the people you care about, right? And that's not what this kind of work is about.
Okay, so you just mentioned asking questions that matter. This may or may not be a set of questions that matter. It's the lightning round. Are you ready?
Yay! Name that tune.
So fill in the blank. Rewriting inner narratives is
empowering.
Is there a practice or routine that helps you grow, nurture, or renew your ability to help people rewrite their inner narrative?
So I can show you, I have 3 different journals that I write in every day. They have different purposes, but I mean, journaling, and being in a daily practice of, paying attention to what's working, and also paying attention to the squirrely negative stories that are creeping up through the ivy.
A favorite book or movie you recently watched and would recommend that has rewriting inner narratives as a theme?
Well, I mean, I'll always say Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. That is one of the most powerful, iconic works about how can you use your mindset to survive, unimaginable horror kind of situation, in the Holocaust, in his case. There's another one, though, that I like that's called The Way of Integrity by Martha Beck. That's a good one for folks who maybe are a little bit earlier in the journey of figuring out what their values are and what's important to them. It's got some worksheets that kind of guides the process of getting to that kind of clarity. So that's another one I'd recommend.
What is one thing that gets in your way of rewriting an inner
Mm,
narrative?
I often have to have a lot of conversations with the controlling part of myself that wants things to be very tidy and logical. And sometimes this work is untidy and
Mm.
not linear and other things. So I often have to tell that part of myself, like, to just take a seat.
That tidy part wants to get through this discussion as quickly as possible and start
Oh yeah.
sorting things
Oh
as
yeah.
quickly as possible, which probably means pushing you back in deeper into that groove.
Yeah. Well, and I see it. I mean, I have some clients who I think, oh, bless your heart. I can understand where that's coming from, where, they're wanting to accelerate the journey, right? Like, okay, got it. Great. Let's get started. I'm gonna boom, boom, boom. 6 months from now, I'm gonna walk into the sunshine. Everything's gonna be great. And I have to say, for sure you can make some progress in that amount of time. But what you really need to be prepared for is a lot of 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, one to the left, one to the right. Like that is just the way these things work. And so coming to acceptance with that is very hard for me, or has traditionally been very hard for me. And I still, it's still something I got to work on all the time.
Which goes back to your second thing that is true about this
Mm,
of having
mm-hmm.
patience
Yes.
and acceptance. What word or phrase describes what rewriting inner narratives feels like when it's had a positive impact?
Mm, freedom.
Hmm, love that. If a listener wants to ask you a question or follow up with you, where do you want to point them to?
My only socials, I'm very simple. I'm just on LinkedIn. Hit me up there. You know, Corinna Calhoun, and I actually do respond most of the time. So
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for sharing what you know to be true about rewriting inner narratives. And I'm really excited to spend some time thinking about my own stories based on this conversation. Those things that I'm telling myself to be true about myself that maybe I need to rethink some of the data and that,
mm,
maybe get myself out of my groove as well. So
mm-hmm.
thank you for spurring thought and for me and for our listeners.
Yeah, for sure. It was fun.
I am grateful for the wisdom and lessons that Corinna shared with us today. And I'm thankful there are people like Corinna in the world that help others who are looking for change, be it in their career, in their personal lives, or in the most dire situations of loneliness and despair. To be able to provide the tools and help others take control of a situation and change the story that led them to the place where they don't want to be and into a new story with a different and positive outcome. Corinna not only has a superpower, but she's a freaking superhero who is changing and saving lives. Corinna uses the groove metaphor for the unchecked and unexamined stories we tell ourselves and how our brain looks for confirming evidence that supports the messages that keep us in that negative groove. Corinna helps people get unstuck by rewriting those stories following a 4-step process. And I'm going to repeat those steps because they're so important. The first step is to write down the story you are telling yourself in as much detail as possible. Second step, write down all the reasons why that story is not true. The third step, write down a new story that you want to be true, of who you want to be and how you want to show up. And fourth, write down all the evidence that points to that new story being true. Corinna shared what she's learned to be true about this process, that it's easier to do the work with someone who is trained to do this work. It takes patience, and ultimately, it works. So the reflection question for us is what is the story we're telling ourselves about our own superhero power? If we want to examine or rewrite that story, we can follow the 4-step process Corinna outlined. So first, as one of her things she knows to be true, this is probably helpful with someone who's trained to do this with us. So perhaps finding a coach would be good. You could start yourself like she did. So write down the story you're telling yourself about your superhero power. Perhaps that story is that you don't know what your superhero power is, or that you don't have one. Second step, write down the evidence you have that says your current story is not true. Again, this is where it might be helpful to ask a trusted friend or colleague about the moments you shine in helping others. Third, what could the new story be about your superhero power? A way to think about that, how could you have even more impact in the service of others? The fourth step, what is already true about that new story? What evidence is there that you are already living that new story? If you don't know what your superpower is, one of the easiest ways to learn more about it is to ask a trusted friend or colleague. And as a heads up, they're likely to ask you what you think their superhero power is. So be ready with a response in advance. I want to reshare 2 resources I mentioned at the top of this episode. If you or someone you know is having a mental health crisis, please call or text 988 immediately. If you're uncomfortable talking on the phone, you can find the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988lifeline.org. That's 988lifeline.org. Additionally, there's the Trevor Project as a resource for youth who are experiencing a mental health crisis or need someone to talk to. The Trevor Project was established for LGBTQ youth. To reach a counselor at the Trevor Project, you can text 678-678. You can call 1-866-488-7386, or you can go to their website at thetrevorproject.org. Again, that website, thetrevorproject.org, and their phone number is 1-866-488-7386. Thank you all for listening in. If you like this pod, please do us a favor and give us a review or click that like button, whichever platform you're on. Thank you for doing that. It's a great way for others to help discover the podcast. What Do You Know to Be True is a 3 Blue Pens production. I'm your host, Roger Kastner. We are recording on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish and Suquamish people. To discover the ancestral lands of the indigenous people whose land you might be on, you can go to native-lands.ca. Be well, my friends.
How's that story working for you? It's as simple as that.
You know, once you buy a car, you see that car everywhere.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that Bader Madoff or Mader Badoff? I always mix up the 2 words. I think it's Bader Madoff.
I don't know, but then you made me think of Bernie Madoff, and I was like, totally not the right person. As long as you're not a weirdo. And even then, I love weirdos.
A lot of thoughts. I'm trying to think of a smart response to that, and I'm not coming up with one. So I'm just going to nod.
Yeah, there are no. Maybe not Meg 2, which I actually did watch the other night. I don't know that Meg 2.
I bet you could pull out a hero's journey in there.
Probably,
or it's the hero's journey of the shark.